Barely Sapient here. Today we're going to talk about Windows 10 LTSC, specifically Windows 10 IoT Enterprise LTSC. This is mainly just a game on, say, a GPU that's a little too old for Linux and happens to be an Nvidia GPU. The compatibility in Linux of, say, a Fermi card is not very good for gaming, unfortunately. The thing about Windows 10 LTSC, especially the IoT version, is that it will get security updates until 2032. So you don't have to worry about it being out of date. Unlike, say, Windows 10 Pro, for instance, which loses support this year or next year, depending on where you live. In most regions, support for Windows 10 Home and Windows 10 Pro ends tomorrow, 14 October 2025. In Europe and in the United Kingdom, apparently, it doesn't end until next year, about the same time. But if you want to continue using Windows and game, you're going to have to do something like use an LTSC version. Finding an ISO image for Windows 10 LTSC isn't that hard. You can find one in Internet Archive or even from Microsoft itself. I recommend using Rufus to make a bootable USB drive to install Windows 10 LTSC, as it gives you the option to skip a lot of the data collection and removes the requirement for a Microsoft online account and some of the system requirements such as secure boot and stuff like that. It just makes it a lot easier to install, not all the hassles. It can be found just by doing an internet search for Rufus. Windows 10 LTSC makes sense for gamers that don't want to upgrade to Windows 11 but still want to play a lot of multiplayer online games that require kernel level access because of the anti-cheats that they employ. Or if you have particularly older hardware that doesn't support Vulkan, but you want to use a computer that still receives security updates and do other things online with it, for instance. So say if you have, on the AMD side, something that's older than GCM 1.0, or if you're on the Nvidia side, something that's older than Kepler, so older than the GTX 600 series of cards. Another advantage of LTSC versions of Windows is they don't come with all the bloat that regular versions come with. Now, for testing, I used my Ryzen 5 1600AF system with 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, and in this case it is a GTX 570 as the GPU. It's older, it doesn't support Vulkan, that's why its support for games in Linux is, well, spotty at best. It's actually a lot different and a lot better in Windows. And that's what people were used to. Now, DirectX 12 titles that require certain features are still not going to run because the video card is just that old. One thing to keep in mind is that Windows 10 LTSC will not really work properly if you don't activate it after 30 days, so you're going to have to shop around for a key. Just make sure you shop around and do your due diligence on that. There's various sites that offer them. The Nvidia GTX 570, when it came out, was quite a powerful card. So it was pretty surprising when I couldn't get Skyrim to work, the original Skyrim that is, in Linux Mint 21 with the 3991.0 series drivers that were available for Linux. Now in Windows this is not a problem. In fact, this card smashes it. It's almost always close to 60. It maintains quite the frame rate. in Windows 10 LTSC. In fact, when I benchmarked, it averaged 59.9 frames per second, had a 0.1% low of 43.3 frames per second, and a 1% low of 58.7 frames per second. So yeah, really powerful card for this game in Windows. Now, Skyrim Special Edition will also run on this card in Windows, but if you try the same settings, 1080p, everything turned all the way up, yeah, this card starts to show its age. You're gonna have to turn down settings. Okay, so let's get this out of the way. Yes, it runs Crysis. Now this is with the settings at 1080p, all of them to very high, all settings set to very high. It averaged 38.9 frames per second, had a 1% low of 17.1 frames per second, and a 0.1% low of 8.1 frames per second. You probably have to turn down some settings on this card, maybe to high, and it would perform better. But this game definitely runs and runs well on this system, on this GPU in Windows 10 LTSC. When this GPU came out, GTA 4 was a popular game, and it performs pretty well on this card, mostly stable. There will be a few dips here and there. This is at 900p with all other settings turned all the way up. You start running into RAM limits on this card because it only has 1.25 gigabytes of video RAM available. Or you can turn the settings down a little bit and run it at 1080p. But for the most part, it's a pretty smooth experience, and it performs better than some newer hardware in this game, as far as the stability anyway. So there is that. It had, at these settings, a frame rate of average of 57.5 frames per second, 1% low of 29.9 frames per second, and a 0.1% of 24.5 frames per second. Because of the video RAM limitations of this card, newer games such as Stray, which is an indie title from 2022, are limited to probably 720p as far as for making it playable, but it does well at 720p at medium settings with an average frame rate of 70 frames per second, a 1% low of 48.3, and a 0.1% low of 38.5, so it's perfectly playable. And this is a game from 2022, 12 years after this card came out, basically. Shadow of Mordor is another example of a game that runs really well at 720p, but is limited by its VRAM on this card. Now, at 720p low, where almost all of its video RAM is saturated, it does run quite well, at almost 100 frames per second most of the time, actually. It actually averaged pretty well in this game, and that was at 96 frames per second. So yeah, and its 1% low was 81 frames per second, and its 0.1% low was 40.7 frames per second in this title. But you can't really turn up the details, or because of the lack of VRAM. It's such an old card, it really hampers performance once you do get past that VRAM limit. Rise of the Tomb Raider is another example of a game that runs okay at 720p. This time it has to be 720p low, just due to the limitations of VRAM on this card. But being as old as it is, you can kind of forgive it. It averaged 55.1 frames per second and had a 1% low of 43.7 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 32.5, so maintaining above 30 the whole time. That's pretty good performance on a fairly advanced game for when it came out at the time. The Witcher 3 is definitely a demanding game, and this one on this card, it's well, it looks like it can play in some of the more, or some of the less busy areas at least, and still can't maintain 60 frames per second as an average. So in busier areas, this might not be playable at all. It averaged 51.8 frames per second and had a 1% low of 29.9 and a 0.1% low of 6.5 frames per second, and this was at 720p low. So this game might not be quite so playable on this game, and again it runs into VRAM limits at these settings. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition will not launch on this GPU. It requires some DirectX 12 features that this card does not support, and it crashed when trying to launch it. GTA 5 Legacy Edition, however, works just fine, and I fiddled around with it with the settings and settled with 720p with a mix of medium and high settings, and I was able to get a pretty substantial frame rate, something in a high refresh rate gaming type of thing. As the game itself averaged 135.7 frames per second and had a 1% low of 101.8 frames per second and a 0.1% low of 4.2, but I think that's when I died in this playthrough. I think that might have been what it was, because it never seemed, the gameplay was pretty stable, as you can see from the frame time graph. Because it's an Nvidia card, even though it's an older one, it supports physics, and games like Batman Arkham City are a perfect example of that. And this game runs quite well on this system. And the in-game benchmark, with all settings turned to their highest and physics set to medium, it had a minimum frame rate of 45 frames per second, a maximum of 113, and an average of 78 on this card. So this card for its time was definitely a powerful card. Will gaming support on GPUs that don't support Vulkan improve in Linux in the future? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. It's not much of a priority. Now, multiplayer gaming, on the other hand, is definitely a priority. Steam definitely wants that, or excuse me, Valve definitely wants that kind of to improve, definitely, as they have an interest in it. And of course, as many gamers do move over from Windows to Linux, which seems to be happening right now, you know, maybe. It's certainly a work in progress, and that situation is improving. But at the time being, for gaming on older hardware that doesn't support Vulkan, but can do some gaming, Windows 10 IoT LTSC certainly makes sense. I'm talking about specifically this GPU in this case, a GTX 570. Now, another way that Windows 10 IoT LTSC would make sense would be if you like to play multiplayer games and you want a Windows that isn't so bloated and you just don't want to upgrade to Windows 11. You can install this instead of, again, it gets security updates until 2032. This GPU is not going to give a great experience in Linux for gaming. And, well, Linux does have a problem with multiplayer gaming at this point. Compatibility's, well, a work in progress with a lot of these anti-cheat systems. So something like this becomes the better option in that case. Well, anywho, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Like and subscribe if you like the video, and comments are always welcome.